I was driving through the worst blizzard I'd seen in years when I spotted her, a figure stumbling through the snow beside the highway, barely visible against the white chaos swirling around us both. Most people would have kept driving, and honestly, part of me wanted to. It was nearly midnight, the roads were treacherous, and I had my own problems to worry about. But something about the way she moved, so determined yet so clearly in trouble, made me pull over. The woman who climbed into my passenger seat that night was shivering so violently she could barely speak, her designer coat soaked through, and her expensive shoes completely wrong for walking in a snowstorm. She looked like money, the kind of person who'd never had to worry about getting stranded anywhere. Her name was Victoria, and as I cranked up the heat and handed her my thermos of coffee, she told me her story. She'd been driving back from a business meeting when her car hit black ice and slid into a ditch about 2 miles back. Her phone was dead, and she'd been walking for over an hour, hoping to find help. "I thought I was going to die out there," she said, her voice still shaky from cold and fear. "Thank you for stopping. Most people wouldn't have." I told her it was nothing, just common decency, but she shook her head. "You'd be surprised how uncommon decency has become," she said with a bitter laugh that told me she knew something about the world that I was still learning. We drove in relative silence to the nearest town, a small place called Milbrook, where I knew there was a decent motel. Victoria spent most of the drive on the phone once we got into cell range, talking to someone about car rentals and business meetings and rearranging her entire schedule. From what I could gather, she was some kind of corporate executive, the type who flew between cities making deals that affected thousands of lives without ever seeing the faces behind the numbers. When we reached the motel, she insisted on paying for 2 rooms, one for herself and one for me, since the storm had made it too dangerous to continue driving that night. I protested, said I could make it home, but she was adamant. "It's the least I can do," she said, and something in her tone suggested she wasn't used to being in anyone's debt. The next morning, Victoria was waiting in the motel lobby when I came down for breakfast, looking polished and professional again in a fresh outfit. She handed me an envelope, thick and formal-looking. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said. "What you did last night, stopping for a stranger in a storm, that says something about who you are. The world needs more people like you, Jake." I opened the envelope expecting maybe a thank you card and some cash for gas. Instead, I found a business card and a letter of recommendation written on official letterhead. Victoria turned out to be Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashford Industries, one of the largest construction and development companies in the region. The letter recommended me for a position in project management on something called Milbrook Commons, a massive mixed-use development that would transform the small town where we'd spent that snowy night. This wasn't just another strip mall or luxury condo complex. This was going to be a community center, affordable housing, local businesses, green spaces, exactly the kind of thoughtful development that small towns like Milbrook desperately needed. The salary was more than I'd ever dreamed of making, and the project seemed designed to help people rather than exploit them. Within a week, I was hired and assigned to the Milbrook Commons project as assistant project manager. It felt like winning the lottery, like my simple act of kindness had somehow unlocked a door to a completely different life. I moved to Milbrook, rented a small apartment downtown, and threw myself into the project with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from believing you're part of something truly meaningful. The plans we were working from showed beautiful, thoughtful spaces designed to bring communities together. The affordable housing units were spacious and well-designed. The community center included everything from a library to a childcare facility to meeting rooms for local organizations. There was even a small medical clinic and a pharmacy, addressing the fact that the nearest hospital was over an hour away. During those early months, I got to know the people of Milbrook, and they got to know me. This was a community that had been struggling for years as local businesses closed and young people moved away looking for opportunities. The Milbrook Commons project represented hope for them, a chance for their town to not just survive, but thrive. I attended town hall meetings where residents shared their excitement about the project. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the local bakery, talked about how the foot traffic from the new development would help her business stay afloat. Tom Rodriguez, a veteran who'd been struggling to find work, saw opportunities in the construction and maintenance jobs the project would create. Even the kids seemed excited, talking about the new playground and the after-school programs that would be available at the community center. But about 4 months into the project, I started noticing discrepancies between the plans we'd presented to the community and the actual construction documents I was seeing. Small things at first: materials specifications that had been downgraded, room sizes that had been reduced, amenities that had been quietly eliminated. When I brought these concerns to my immediate supervisor, David Walsh, he told me not to worry about it. "Projects evolve," he said with a dismissive wave. "What matters is delivering on time and under budget." But the changes kept coming, and they kept getting bigger. The affordable housing units that had been advertised as spacious 2- and 3-bedroom apartments were being built as cramped efficiency units. The community center that was supposed to include a full library was being reduced to a single room with a few bookcases. The medical clinic was being eliminated entirely, along with the pharmacy and most of the meeting rooms. The green spaces were being paved over to add more parking, and the playground equipment was being swapped out for cheaper alternatives. Each change was presented as a minor adjustment, a necessary compromise to keep the project financially viable. But when you added them all up, the Milbrook Commons that was actually being built bore almost no resemblance to the community-focused development that had been promised. I started documenting everything, comparing the original plans with the construction documents, photographing the changes as they were implemented. What I discovered was a systematic pattern of deception that went far beyond simple cost-cutting measures. The affordable housing units were being built to barely meet minimum legal requirements, with walls so thin you could hear every conversation in adjacent units. The commercial spaces were being designed with lease terms that would price out local businesses in favor of chain stores. Even the materials being used were substandard, cheaper alternatives that looked good initially but would deteriorate quickly. When I tried to raise these concerns with David Walsh, he became noticeably less friendly. "You're new here, Jake," he said during what he called a mentoring conversation, but felt more like a warning. "We promised the moon during the proposal phase because that's what gets projects approved. But once construction begins, reality sets in. We have to make adjustments to stay profitable." I asked him about the specific promises that had been made to the Milbrook community, the commitments that had been put in writing. His response was chilling in its casual indifference. "Community presentations are marketing, not contracts," he said. "As long as we meet the minimum legal requirements, we're in the clear." But I'd read the contracts, and I knew he was wrong. The development agreement that Ashford Industries had signed with the town included specific commitments about the size and amenities of the affordable housing units, the services that would be available at the community center, and the types of businesses that would be prioritized. When I pointed this out to Walsh, his demeanor changed completely. "Let me give you some advice, Jake," he said, leaning back in his chair with a cold smile. "You have a bright future here if you play your cards right. But you need to understand something about corporate development. We don't succeed by being idealistic. The people in Milbrook are getting new housing and new businesses. They should be grateful for what they're getting." I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about one development project. This was about a fundamental difference in values, a clash between two completely different ways of seeing the world. To Walsh, and apparently to Victoria Ashford, the people of Milbrook were just another market to be exploited. That night, I went back to my apartment and spread out all the documentation I'd been collecting. Construction plans, contract amendments, email correspondence, photographs of substandard materials. I had enough evidence to prove that Ashford Industries was systematically violating their agreement with the town. As I sat there surrounded by documents, I kept thinking about that night in the snowstorm. Victoria Ashford had seemed genuinely grateful for my help, genuinely impressed by what she called my decency and values. She'd written that the world needed more people like me, but now I was beginning to wonder if she'd meant that at all, or if it had just been another form of marketing. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to my supervisor or trying to work within the corporate hierarchy, I decided to take my evidence directly to Victoria Ashford herself. If she really was the person who'd written that letter, who'd spoken about the importance of decency and values, then surely she'd want to know what was happening and fix the problems I'd discovered. Getting a meeting with Victoria turned out to be more difficult than I'd anticipated, but when I mentioned that I was working on the Milbrook Commons project and had some urgent concerns, her assistant managed to find 15 minutes in her schedule. The Ashford Industries headquarters was everything you'd expect: sleek glass exterior, marble lobby, expensive art on the walls. Victoria's office was larger than most people's apartments, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. When she turned to greet me, I was struck again by how different she looked from the frightened woman I'd rescued from that snowstorm. This Victoria Ashford was polished, powerful, completely in control. "Jake," she said with apparent warmth, "it's so good to see you again. I hope you're settling in well at Milbrook." I thanked her for the opportunity, and then showed her my documentation, side-by-side comparisons of the original plans and the current construction documents, photographs of substandard materials, copies of the development agreement, highlighting the specific commitments that weren't being met. Victoria listened politely, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished my presentation, she was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents. "This is very thorough work, Jake," she said finally. "You're absolutely right. There are significant discrepancies between our original proposal and what's actually being built." I felt a surge of relief. She understood the problem, and she was going to fix it. But then she continued, and everything changed. "The question is, what did you think was going to happen when you brought this to me?" There was something in her tone that hadn't been there before, something cold and calculating. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," I said. "I thought you'd want to know about these problems so we could correct them and honor the commitments the company made." Victoria laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that suggested she found anything amusing. "Jake, you seem to be operating under the assumption that those commitments were made in good faith, that we actually intended to build everything we promised during the proposal phase. That's charmingly naive." She walked to the windows, gazing out at the city below. "Let me explain something to you about how development really works. When we propose a project like Milbrook Commons, we're selling a dream. We're telling people what they want to hear, so they'll support our project and expedite our permits, and provide us with the tax incentives we need to make the project profitable." I sat there stunned, trying to process what she was saying. "But the development agreement is a legal document that we wrote very carefully," she interrupted. "Every commitment includes language about subject to availability, dependent on market conditions, or as financially feasible. Our lawyers made sure we had plenty of wiggle room." She turned back to face me, and I saw something in her expression that I recognized from that night in the snowstorm, the look of someone who understood the world in a way that others didn't. The affordable housing units we're building meet the legal definition of affordable housing. The community center meets the minimum requirements for community amenities. Everything we promised is being delivered, just not necessarily in the way that people might have expected. I thought about Mrs. Henderson and her excitement about the foot traffic, about Tom Rodriguez and the opportunities he saw in the project, about all the residents who had shared their hopes for their community's future. "What about the people who believed in this project?" I asked. "What about the promises you made to them directly?" Victoria's expression hardened. "What about them? They're getting more than they had before, aren't they? Their property values are going to increase. They'll have new shopping and dining options. The fact that we had to make some modifications to ensure the project's financial viability doesn't negate those benefits." She sat down behind her desk, arranging my documents into a neat stack. "Jake, I'm going to be very direct with you. You helped me when I needed help, and I appreciate that more than you know. That's why I gave you this opportunity, why I brought you into this company. But your job is not to second-guess the business decisions that have already been made. Your job is to execute the project as efficiently as possible." She leaned forward, her voice taking on an almost conspiratorial tone. "I see great potential in you. With the right guidance and the right attitude, You could be running your own projects within 5 years, making more money than you ever imagined possible. The offer was seductive, but as she talked, I kept thinking about something she'd said that night in the snowstorm. You'd be surprised how uncommon decency has become. At the time, I'd thought she was lamenting that fact. Now I understood that she'd simply been stating it as a business reality. What if I can't do that? I asked. What if I can't just ignore the fact that we're breaking promises we made to people who trusted us? Victoria's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere. Then you'll need to decide what's more important to you, your ideals or your career. Because I can guarantee you that if you try to make this into some kind of crusade, your career and development will be over before it really begins. She stood up and walked around the desk to where I was sitting. This is a small industry, Jake. People talk. If word gets out that you're the kind of person who causes problems for projects that are already underway, you'll find it very difficult to get hired anywhere else. The threat was delivered calmly, but its meaning was unmistakable. Victoria wasn't just asking me to stay quiet. She was making it clear that speaking up would destroy any chance I had of working in my field ever again. I want you to think very carefully about your next steps, she continued. Consider what's really at stake here. Think about the life you want to build for yourself, the security you want to have, and then ask yourself whether it makes sense to throw all of that away for the sake of some abstract principle. She picked up the folder containing all my evidence. I'll hold on to this. No copies have been made, no reports have been filed. You can go back to Milbrook tomorrow and continue doing excellent work, or you can choose to make this into a problem that will hurt more people than it helps, including yourself. As I reached the door, Victoria called my name one last time. She was holding a small snow globe with a miniature winter scene inside. I bought this the day after you rescued me from that storm, she said. I wanted something to remind me of that night, of the kindness you showed a stranger. I'd like you to have it. For a moment, I saw something that might have been regret in her eyes, or maybe just nostalgia for a simpler version of herself. I took the snow globe and walked out, knowing that everything had changed, and that the decision I made next would determine not just my future, but the future of everyone in Milbrook who had believed in the promises that had been made to them. That night I sat in my apartment, turning Victoria's snow globe over in my hands and watching the artificial snow swirl around the miniature scene inside. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd given me a memento of the night that had supposedly demonstrated my decency. On the same day, she'd made it clear that decency had no place in her business model. But as I thought about our conversation, I realized that Victoria had actually given me something far more valuable than a snow globe. She had given me information. In her arrogance, she had revealed the full scope of what Ashford Industries was doing in Milbrook and probably in other communities. She had essentially confessed to a systematic pattern of deception, assuming that her threats would be enough to keep me from acting on that knowledge. The next morning, instead of going to the construction site, I drove to the Milbrook Public Library to research other cases where developers had made similar promises to communities and then failed to deliver. What I found was both encouraging and terrifying. There were cases where community activists had successfully challenged large development companies, but I also found stories about what happened to the individuals who had led those challenges: lawsuits, career destruction, personal harassment. The people who had been successful hadn't worked alone. They had built coalitions, gathered allies, and created enough public pressure to make fighting back more expensive than simply honoring the original agreements. I spent the rest of the day developing a strategy. First, I would need to recreate all the documentation that Victoria had confiscated. Then, I would need allies, people in the community who had the most to lose and the credibility to speak out publicly. Finally, I would need a platform to tell the story, some way to generate media attention that would be impossible for Ashford Industries to ignore. The documentation part was easier than I'd expected. As a project manager, I had legitimate access to construction files, and it took me 3 days to reassemble everything I'd shown Victoria, plus additional evidence I'd discovered. For community allies, I approached 3 people: Mrs. Henderson, whose bakery was counting on foot traffic from the development; Tom Rodriguez, the veteran who had been vocal about job opportunities, and Susan Chen, a retired teacher who understood what the loss of a real library would mean for local families. I approached each of them separately, explaining what I'd discovered and showing them the evidence. Their reactions ranged from disappointment to fury, but all three were willing to listen to my proposal for how we might force Ashford Industries to honor their commitments. Mrs. Henderson was particularly upset about the commercial leasing arrangements, which favored chain stores over local businesses. They told us this would help local entrepreneurs, she said, but these lease terms are designed to squeeze out anyone who can't afford corporate-level rent. Tom Rodriguez focused on the construction shortcuts that would require constant repairs. When these buildings start falling apart in 5 years, who's going to pay for that? The people living in those affordable housing units. Susan Chen understood what the elimination of the medical clinic and library services would mean. There are families here who depend on that clinic for basic health care. And the library, that's about computer access, job training programs, after-school tutoring. They're taking away the things that give people opportunities. For the media platform, I remembered something Victoria had said about this being Ashford Industries' standard operating procedure. If I could prove this wasn't an isolated case, but part of a systematic business model, the story would become much bigger. I researched other Ashford Industries projects and found similar patterns everywhere. In Riverside County, they had promised affordable senior housing with medical care, then delivered generic apartments with no health services. In Oakdale, they had committed to preserving historical buildings, then demolished them and blamed, quote, structural issues. In Pine Valley, they had promised environmental safeguards and green spaces, then eliminated them citing, quote, soil conditions. The pattern was unmistakable. Ashford Industries was running a systematic scam across multiple communities, using legal language to promise one thing and deliver another. I contacted Linda Martinez, an investigative reporter who had won awards for corporate corruption coverage. When I showed her what I'd assembled, documentation of violations in Milbrook, evidence of similar patterns elsewhere, voices of deceived community members, her reaction was immediate. This is exactly the kind of story we've been looking for, she said. Corporate accountability, community impact, systematic deception, it has everything. And the fact that you're an insider makes it even more compelling. She explained that her newspaper had been tracking complaints about Ashford Industries for months, but they'd never had someone on the inside who could provide detailed documentation. But I have to warn you, she continued. Once the story breaks, they're going to come after you with everything they have. Legal threats, character assassination, attempts to discredit your evidence. I told her about Victoria's threats and what I was risking. The thing is, I don't think I can live with myself if I stay quiet and let this happen. These people trusted the promises that were made to them. Linda smiled for the first time. In my experience, the people who succeed in taking on corporate bullies are usually the ones who have that kind of clarity about why they're doing it. I also contacted the state's Public Integrity Unit. Agent Sarah Kim reviewed my documentation with methodical thoroughness, particularly interested in the development agreement violations and evidence of systematic deception. What you're describing could constitute fraud under several state statutes, she said. If we can prove that Ashford Industries never intended to fulfill these commitments, we're looking at potential criminal charges. She explained that whistleblower protections would apply to my situation, making it harder for Ashford Industries to retaliate legally. I can't promise they won't try to make your life difficult, but any attempts to intimidate a witness will result in additional charges. That evening, I met with Mrs. Henderson, Tom Rodriguez, and Susan Chen to update them. All three were nervous but determined. My grandfather fought in World War II, Tom said. He used to tell me that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Well, we're not going to do nothing. The next few days passed quietly, which should have been my first warning. Then, on Friday morning, everything exploded. I arrived at the construction site to find unusual activity, more supervisors than normal, several people I didn't recognize wearing Ashford Industries badges, and an atmosphere of tension. David Walsh called me into the office trailer where a woman I'd never seen before was waiting. "Jake, this is Margaret Foster," Walsh said. "She's the head of corporate security. She'd like to ask you a few questions." Foster didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're aware that you've been in contact with reporters and state investigators. We're also aware that you've been sharing confidential company information. I'm here to give you an opportunity to explain your actions before we decide how to proceed." They knew about my meetings with Linda Martinez and Agent Kim, which meant they'd been monitoring my activities more closely than I'd thought possible. "We have security footage of you meeting with Linda Martinez," Foster said. "We have phone records showing calls to the Public Integrity Unit. We have computer logs showing that you accessed project files outside normal business hours." The scope of their surveillance was impressive and terrifying. "However, we're prepared to be reasonable. Ms. Ashford values the relationship she has with you, and she recognizes that you may have been acting out of misguided idealism rather than malicious intent." She pulled out several documents. "We're prepared to offer you a promotion and a transfer to our Phoenix office, effective immediately. You'd be managing a major commercial development with a substantial salary increase. In exchange, you would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and cease all contact with reporters, investigators, and community activists." The salary was more than double what I was making, exactly the kind of opportunity most people would jump at. "What happens if I don't accept this offer?" I asked. "Then we'll pursue all available legal remedies for your breach of contract and theft of proprietary information. We'll also inform other companies about your conduct, which would make it very difficult for you to find comparable employment anywhere else." I thought about Victoria's snow globe, about Mrs. Henderson's determination to fight for her community, about Tom Rodriguez's belief that good people had an obligation not to do nothing when confronted with evil. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally. Foster checked her watch. "You have until Monday morning. If you haven't accepted our offer by then, we'll assume you've chosen to proceed with your current course of action, and we'll respond accordingly." That afternoon, I called Linda Martinez to warn her. "They know about our meeting. They've been watching me, probably since the day I first raised concerns." Linda wasn't surprised. "The fact that they're trying to silence you just confirms that your story is accurate and damaging. We're running the story in Sunday's edition, regardless of any pressure they try to apply." That night, I barely slept. By Sunday morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to take Foster's offer. I wasn't going to disappear to Phoenix and pretend none of this had happened. At exactly 6 a.m., Linda Martinez's story hit the website under the headline, "Promises Made, Promises Broken: How One Developer's Community Commitments Became Corporate Profit Centers." The article was everything I had hoped: thorough, well-documented, and devastating. It included quotes from Mrs. Henderson, Tom Rodriguez, and Susan Chen, along with responses from residents of other communities where Ashford Industries had broken similar promises. It included side-by-side comparisons of what had been promised versus what was being delivered, financial analysis of how the modifications would affect community members, and expert commentary on the legal and ethical implications. Most importantly, it included Victoria Ashford's response to detailed questions. Her statement was a masterpiece of corporate non-accountability. Ashford Industries remains committed to delivering high-quality developments that serve the needs of the communities where we work. While project specifications may evolve during the construction process due to unforeseen circumstances and market conditions, we always strive to exceed our legal obligations and provide maximum value to residents and local businesses. Reading her response, I realized that Victoria had learned nothing from our conversation. She still believed that legal compliance was sufficient justification for breaking promises, that meeting minimum requirements was the same as honoring commitments. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by news outlets across the state and was generating exactly the kind of public outrage Linda Martinez had predicted. The state attorney general announced that his office would be reviewing Ashford Industries' business practices. Several legislators called for hearings on accountability and public-private development partnerships. Community groups in cities where Ashford Industries had current projects began organizing to demand reviews of their own development agreements. Victoria Ashford had taught me that decency was uncommon in her world, that it was something to be exploited rather than honored. But she had also underestimated what happens when decent people decide they've had enough of being exploited. Sometimes the stranger you help in a snowstorm turns out to be exactly the person you need to fight. And sometimes the kindness they try to use against you becomes the very thing that gives you the strength to stand up to them.